Today we're just going to go for a quick overview of Frontline Gaming's ITC, the world's biggest independent tournament circuit for Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy and tactics focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. So as voted by the channel's Patreons, over on the Auspex Tactics Patreon site, people seem to be very keen that I cover a fair bit about 40k tournaments and the ITC this month. So with that in mind, this is the first in a short series of videos on Tournament 40k. This one's going to aim to function as an intro and overview to Frontline Gaming and the ITC. In the next couple of videos we'll look at their champions missions and have a talk about ITC secondaries, and we'll round it all off by doing a bit more of a generalist video in tips and strategies to maximise your score at 40k tournaments. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So the ITC is the world's biggest standardised set of 40k tournament rules, where players around the world can compete under a system that they know well, that will translate well from one region to another, and one tournament to the next. It was largely born out of the lack of support that Games Workshop put forward for competitive play, including closing down their major US tournaments in the past, and the fact that previous editions of the game in particular were not at all well balanced, and the rules for their missions weren't very conducive to two optimised armies having a reasonably fair fight in a game of 40k. The ITC originated in America, and particularly over the last couple of years has gained a far more global appeal. I've noticed the events in the UK gradually changing to ITC over the last few years. This ITC offers a framework where a tournament organiser can sign up their event to the ITC, have a standardised rule pack, allow players to keep track of their rankings relative to each other based on their performances over multiple tournaments, and the idea is that the ITC Champions missions make a game of 40k a lot more of a balanced affair. Now Frontline Gaming are the company that orchestrate the ITC. They're heavily involved in big tournaments in the US such as the LVO, Bay Area Open and SoCal, and on their website they also do regular 40k tactics articles and sell a bunch of wargaming accessories and things like their battle mats. Tournament organisers, or TOs, basically get in touch with the ITC when they want to register their event to be part of the global system, and if they do, then it allows the players who attend those events to submit their scores, so we get to see which players are doing better in the game as a whole. This is done by the ITC Ranking System. There's one for 40k and AOS, and you can look at it on Frontline Gaming's website. The bigger and more prestigious the event, the more points you get for placing highly in it, because in general it'll mean that you've seen off more competition and tougher lists to get to the top. So the players that win these events get really good boosts to their scores. You can see breakdowns of these rankings based on region, so you could tell who was the best player in all of Canada or all of Scandinavia, for example. As well as this, the ITC also breaks down the results in terms of different factions, which can incentivise people to try out different and more varied armies, as you could have the bragging rights of being the best Blood Angels player in the world, for example. I quite like the faction-specific rankings. It certainly adds a layer of interest. Naturally, these rankings are quite heavily dependent on the amount of players who have the time and money to travel to all of these big tournaments. If you can only attend one or two events a year, you're quite unlikely to ever make it too high in the list. To rise to the top of these rankings, you're going to need a significant amount of time, money and dedication at your hands, as well as just being good at playing model soldiers. The ITC keeps track of these rankings primarily via the Best Coast Pairings app. I touched on this in the last tournament related video, and I'm sure a lot of people listening will be very well familiar with it. Basically, you can use it to submit your list before an event, so the tournament organiser has easy digital access to all army lists of the entrants, to ensure everything is fair and above board, and then the scores in each game are entered via your own event-specific PIN number to clarify the amount of points scored in each game for both players. My experience with it is that it works very well when it works, but it does have an unfortunate habit of crashing a bit, which can be frustrating when you're in the middle of an event, particularly with low internet signal. The app also stores the winning lists for various tournaments, so people who pay the subscription fee to support the app can see the winning lists that have been happening at different events. I myself haven't got this yet, though I'm quite tempted to allow some more competitive list analysis on the channel. As it is, it's £47 a year, at least in the UK. While not an enormous cost for people who play Warhammer, it's not small either. You could very nearly get yourself a Start Collecting box instead, if you save the money. Other than that app, the usual standards for ITC events include a 3-colour minimum for painting your army. This means, for example, you could paint your Space Marines red and paint the guns black with silver bits for the metal, and you'd be good to go, at least where the event rules are concerned. They also generally stipulate that the model should be based, at least having some texture on the base and some colour applied, although different events do operate at different standards. Talking of bases, that's sometimes a bit of a contentious issue in competitive circles. That wasn't intentional, but come to think of it, competitive circles is exactly what 40k bases are. Anyway, small tangents aside, the ITC has an advisory base guide for what your models should be mounted on, mainly to avoid weird discrepancies between old and new models, or people trying to model their miniatures on very big or very small bases to gain advantages. I don't think that this actually tends to happen in practice very much from the vast majority of the community, but there'll be always people who are there to maximise every loophole, including modelling. I'll be honest, I do find this a little bit onerous, particularly when some players have models that were sold with one-sided base, and just because Games Workshop have updated the kit, Frontline Gaming do recommend that you change to the upscaled bases. Orc Boys are one particularly notable example of this, and one that I have personally. Games Workshop repackaged them to be standing on 32mm bases rather than the standard 25, which all of my 200 plus Orc Boys are mounted on. Therefore, in Frontline Gaming's basing recommendation chart, they recommend that you use the 32 ones, which puts me into a bit of a modelling conundrum as to whether I can be bothered to fit base extenders to all of those models, particularly when they're fully painted and based to a reasonable standard. I can see why they do this, to make sure that all players have a level playing field competitively and not to punish newer players who bought the models more recently, but it is a bit of a contentious one, seeing as Games Workshop themselves don't enforce this sort of rule. Moving on. They also have very in-depth sportsmanship guidelines, aimed to cover all eventualities when players attempt to cheat or abuse the rules, and plenty of events say that they use these, though I've never had personally any interaction with them whenever I've played ITC events. In general, the vast majority of people who you meet are perfectly reasonable, and quick rules questions can just be answered by a tournament organiser. In addition to this, they also have some optional chess clock rules, used for preventing slow play, and they often tend to be cracked out at the highest levels of competition, although not many events actually use them as standard, and I've not come across too many examples of slow play in recent years at all. Finally, in terms of the missions themselves, the main ITC rules document says that their events either use the Eternal War missions from Chapter Approved, and they do also have the option of their ITC Champions mission pack, which are the rules that most people associate with the ITC. Missions often with certain set objectives, primary objectives scoring points for killing a unit, holding an objective, killing more than your opponent, and holding more than your opponent, as the well-known and much debated ITC secondaries, where each player gets to pick 3 more objectives to pursue over the course of the game. The aim of these missions is to create more balanced games, where the outcome of the battle is truly decided by which player is the better general, rather than some of the random more swingy missions that Games Workshop have from their core book scenarios. Over the past few years, I've generally thought that the ITC missions do generally do this quite well, particularly when in some of the original book missions, when 8th came out, you have things like kill points, which can be basically massively skewed in the favour of one player, just depending on what sort of army they brought. For example, a player with 30 units will really struggle to beat an Imperial Knight player with 5 units if the only objective is kill points, meaning that basically no matter how well the first player plays, he's almost certainly going to lose just because of the format. ITC does do a whole load better than this, although there are certainly debates around a lot of the secondaries. You can easily build lists which are very hard to take secondaries from, in terms of any of the killing objectives at least, whereas some units in the game are absolutely terrible in ITC, due to them being incredibly easy to score for multiple secondaries. For example, things that are characters and also vehicles with a lot of wounds tend to give up secondaries like no tomorrow. I think that the gap has certainly narrowed between Games Workshop's Chapter Approved missions and the ITC missions. Indeed, I'm pretty certain that Games Workshop have taken a lot of inspiration by the various rules put forward by the ITC over the years, and to some extent have been playing catch-up. Some of the latest Chapter Approved 2019 missions bear some very uncanny resemblances to the ITC format, for example. Besides the actual mission rules themselves, ITC has one of its most famous rules in that bottom floor ruins always block line of sight. I certainly think that when you get to a certain level, good line of sight blocking terrain is really important for a balanced game in 40k, particularly to allow the player who's going second to shelter some of their key units, so they don't just get blasted off the table turn 1. ITC's clever ruling basically means that any enclosed windows or doors on the ground floor of a ruins level count as blocking line of sight, which is really helpful because a load of Games Workshop's kits have big windows in them, and the way that 8th gives line of sight to everything means that you only need the tiniest amount of one model to see the tiniest amount of another one, and you can shoot at them with no penalty. Again, this is a rule that Games Workshop have borrowed themselves. Their grand tournaments at Warhammer World utilise a very similar but slightly different version of this, where instead of enclosed windows and doors providing blocking line of sight, it's the entire bottom level of a ruin, provided there's at least one bit of ruin intact at ground level. One potential problem with this rule, at least on ITC's part, is that it can create the magic box situation, where you can have an infantry unit inside a ruin, and they can't be shot by anything else on your opponent's army, unless they have weapons that ignore line of sight. If the defender is positioned properly as well, it can also be impossible to assault them, due to the size of the model bases and the width of the ruin wall. I'll be honest, I'm a really big fan of the line of sight blocking ruins on the ground floor, but much less of a fan of the magic boxes, as creating situations where certain armies can on no account interact with each other isn't the best for the game in my opinion. I much prefer ruins that say have 3 sides, and then one open side so they still can be countered by enemies with decent movement. After you've actually played the missions, the scoring is done on that Best Coast Pairings app, and the main differentials is actually whether or not you win, lose or draw the game. This is different to some other tournament systems that use a 20-0 type tournament scoring system, where you could win all your games, but if you don't win them by very much, a player with all wins and 1 loss could potentially score higher than you if he beat all of his opponents by more. I quite like this system, to be honest, as it combines well with the Swiss system, which means people with the same number of wins and losses play each other. It means that over the course of a tournament, you will get the best of the best coming up against each other, and everyone else gets more balanced games as the day goes on. So it's primarily done on wins and losses, with victory points being a tiebreaker to differentiate the players who had the same amounts of wins, draws and losses. Overall, I really like the ITC. In general, they've managed to do wonders for the competitive game of 40k, and frankly Games Workshop has a lot to thank them for in terms of encouraging the competitive community and helping that side of the game flourish. That isn't to say that there isn't potential room for improvement, there always is with everything, but like Games Workshop, they do review their rules regularly. There'll often be tweaks of the secondaries year on year, based on player feedback. So that's the general introduction to the ITC done. As I said before, in future videos we'll be taking a look at the missions themselves, and also a bit of an in-depth look at the ITC secondaries in terms of how to pick them and how to defend against them. If I've made any mistakes or errors with anything in the video, please let me know. I was kind of surprised I couldn't find an obvious overview of the ITC and Frontline Gaming with a quick Google search, so all this was a little bit pieced together. If there is anything amiss, let me know in the comments and I'll post a correction. If you'd like to see the rest of the tournament series, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. We also have new 40k content coming out every single day. If you'd like to support the channel and you live in the UK, I do have an Element Games affiliate link, where if you place any orders of Warhammer through them and get the 10 to 20% discount that they provide, then a small amount of the profits go towards supporting the channel. So please consider that as an option if you are thinking about ordering in any Warhammer models in the near future. Thanks again for listening to Auspex Tactics. I'll hope to see you guys next time.